Joining us now is a researcher at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, Rosie Collington. Did that study come as any surprise to you?
Yeah, I want to begin by saying that the results from this study are just really incredibly tragic. And just because they are somewhat predictable, they are predictable, unfortunately, it does not make them any less tragic, of course. So the additional deaths identified in the study between 2012 and 2019, so before the pandemic, reflect an increase in people dying prematurely from things like a reduced income, ill health, poor nutrition, housing, and social isolation. So these are things that the authors correctly identify as being a consequence of the austerity program that was implemented by the Conservative coalition government in the wake of the financial crisis. But really, this increased mortality and poorer health more generally were entirely predictable. We've known for a long time that austerity agendas or cuts to public services do have an adverse effect on health outcomes. And we've had plenty of evidence in leading health journals that in other countries, for example, Greece, notably in Greece, which implemented these very harsh austerity policies in the wake of its financial crisis, have had terrible effects on mortality, on suicide, for example, and health outcomes more generally. I just want to say also, it's common sense that this would happen. You know, when you spend less, you get less. You can't expect to have a world-leading public health system that meets the needs of people when you haven't been investing in it.
As you say, it's a cumulative effect of public services being squeezed. Many people that work for the NHS, doctors and nurses, would say already feels as though it's on the brink of collapse. They're really struggling to meet the needs of patients. But let me ask you, as difficult as the last 10 years has been for many people in the country, and as bad as it feels for many people now, how much worse could it get in the next 10 years? The next decade is expected to bring even more hardship, isn't it?
Yeah, so, you know, I don't want to be completely doom and gloom, but you're right. So this study specifically looked at the effects of austerity between 2012 and 2019 on excess mortality. But in terms of the broader problems that we're seeing in health and across our economy and in public services, it's fair to say that while these are, you know, in large part the result of political and economic choices that the government has made over the past decade, they are also a consequence of cumulative political decisions that have been made in terms of investment and decisions that have had the effect of hollowing out public services for a long time. You know, we can't control the weather, but we can control how prepared we are for it. And many researchers and economists in recent years, for example, have been arguing that this storm that we're currently experiencing with the energy crisis was on its way because of Britain's dependence on fossil fuels from Russia. But rather than invest in renewable energy infrastructure that might have meant we were less dependent on Russia for oil and gas, as countries such as Denmark did back in the 1970s, and as other countries in Europe have done, governments in the UK have kicked the can down the road, and we're really seeing the kind of long tail of those decisions now.
Very briefly, can anything be done to prevent it getting worse?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You know, we've seen in the past few weeks, you know, after a very long time of people being frankly very generous towards the government throughout the pandemic, and saying, you know, many people are familiar with this line that Boris is doing his best with a bad situation. Increasingly, people have become very frustrated. They're recognizing that there are alternatives. You know, we're seeing increased appetite among trade unions, for example, for strike action, which is putting pressure on governments. We've seen this U-turn over the past week in some government policy areas. And we're seeing a huge swing against the Conservative Party in opinion polls as well. So I think there is an appetite for an economy that puts health and the interests of people before, you know, some kind of vague notion of growth that is based on trickle-down economics, which doesn't have an evidence base anyway. You know, since the 1980s, which is when we saw the kind of emergence of this idea and these political decisions, productivity has stagnated and workers' share of profits has fallen. It doesn't work on its own terms. And I think people are beginning to identify this now and thinking about, you know, what might an economy look like that put their interests, that put the interests of health and welfare at the forefront.
Rosie Collington, thank you very much.
Thank you.